Welcome, everybody. Great to see you on this rather cold Brussels evening. I'm Tom de Waal, and with me we have a very distinguished group. And it's good to see you in the room, but we also have many, many people joining us online from around the world. So these are obviously our momentous times, not least in the South Caucasus, an enormous amount going on in that region that we know, love, and study. The elections in Georgia, which have created a constitutional and political deadlock in that country, in which the EU is obviously very involved. Azerbaijan next week is about to host COP29 and almost confirming Azerbaijan's status as the most powerful country in the region, and also a country which is leveraging its international contacts east, west, north, and south. But that's obviously against a bigger context of continuing war in Ukraine, and not least, of course, major geopolitical repercussions from this week and the re-election of Donald Trump as US president. So we have had two papers as part of our Europe's East series at Carnegie Europe, which I lead, commissioned two excellent papers recently. One by Tinatin Akhvlediani, research fellow at CEPS, just down the street. Another by Jody LaPorte, who is fellow in politics and international relations at Lincoln College, Oxford. Two excellent papers. Tina's looking more at the EU and particularly its economic relationship with the South Caucasus as a whole, particularly Georgia and Armenia. Jody looking at the political economy of Azerbaijan ahead of COP, its reliance on hydrocarbons, its political structures, and also what its commitments to transition to a green economy mean in practice. And last but not least, I'm very pleased to welcome here a friend, colleague, brilliant researcher on South Caucasus, Laurence Broers, associate fellow at Chatham House and author of many excellent publications on the region. So what we're going to do is a few introductory remarks from our two authors and speakers about the themes that they're working on. Then Laurence is going to give some comments as a discussant and ask a couple of questions. And then we're going to open up first to you in the room and then to all of you. Which camera should I be looking at over there? All of you, welcome to you. You're not so close, but you're equally dear to us online. So that's what we're going to do. If you want to read the papers, we don't have print copies, but there are QR codes over there which you can scan, or also obviously you can look them up online. As many other publications, both in Carnegie's Europe's East series and also, of course, on many other topics. And last but not least, please do stick around. We'll talk for about an hour, so we started a bit late, so just after 6, we can offer you a drink and a chat in this room. So please don't go away if you can stay. So with that, Tina, very good to see you. Please kick us off.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thanks a lot for having us, and thanks a lot for bringing the focus to the South Caucasus region, which is very, very important. So the paper that I had a pleasure to contribute to the Europe's East project brings some zooms into the geoeconomics that we can actually witness into the region. Okay, I'm notified that it's, do you hear me? Talks towards the microphone, okay. Technology, let me put it a bit down. Okay. Oops. But for the online audience, I think I should keep it. I think now it's good. Great. So what I was saying is that what we could witness into the region and how it's been shaping is that always the foreign policy stances of the three South Caucasus states and their security concerns have very much determined their economic relations with the European Union. And then with the outbreak of the second war, Nagorno-Karabakh, and then the Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine have actually made it very, very clear. What we are witnessing now and how the economic relations has been, shaped, we are seeing how come security concerns, which have been always at the heart of these relations, are now focused how much they actually play the key role, even when it comes to the market forces and even when it comes to the economic relations. Now, we're talking about three states that have taken quite different stances. So one is Georgia, which has signed the Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Area Association Agreement with the European Union and currently holds the candidate status, although its European integration is frozen. We can talk about it later. And then Armenia, which, ditched in a way the negotiated association agreement and in fact settled for something less ambitious, which is SEPA, truncated version of the DCFTA, and then Azerbaijan, who really focused on purely economic, in a way, energy cooperation. So that was the background, and then we see now how the two wars have changed, reshaped these economic relations, and where we stand now. And very briefly, just to refer what the paper finds as the key outcomes, is that, DCFTAs, in fact, have been less ambitious for Georgia, and in fact, country, in a way, can be utilized as the sanction-proof corridor for EU-Russia. It still fits the Russian demand for the European goods, and there are still the incidents where the Russian energy supplies still come back to Europe, which is not quite promising for the candidate country. Then the same story is observed in Armenia, although Armenia is a Eurasian Economic Union country. And then with Azerbaijan, we see just more importance attached to the energy cooperation, which of course Jody will talk more elaborately about. And all these just really tells us that this region is really important, and EU should not really underestimate how much importance does the region bring. These are small open economies. However, they offer the gateway to the between Europe and Asia, and they are very, very important for the trade and transit routes. And that's what we are basically observing into the trade data, into the investments, and all the numbers that really show a lot of structural changes and the spikes as a result of the tours. So I'll stop here, Tom, and we can explore further.
Thank you so much. Jody.
Yes, thank you for the invitation for this evening. My contribution to this discussion and to the series uses the COP29 and Azerbaijan's presidency as a jumping off point to consider the stability of Azerbaijan's political economy and the future of an oil-reliant state in the era of climate change, and in particular with Azerbaijan in an era where Azerbaijan is looking to assert its leadership in this era. In this area of climate mitigation efforts. So more generally, I think it's a nice opportunity to examine what climate change and efforts to mitigate climate change mean for a rentier state, because Azerbaijan is, of course, not the only country facing this challenge. So, as I'm sure we're all familiar, Azerbaijan has developed its economy over the past 30 years around the hydrocarbon sector, such that oil and gas have constituted 90% of the country's exports, contributed about 30% of GDP, and a significant proportion of state revenue as well. And so oil rents, the money that's generated from the extraction and export of oil over the past decades, has stabilized Azerbaijan's political scene, as well as underpinned its economic model. It's also served to benefit the people in power and the ruling elites who have access to some of the benefits financially associated with those profits. Into this, of course, comes some of the market forces that we're seeing. First of all, the imperatives of climate change and the global move away from fossil fuels generated by some of the agreements coming out of the COPs, which we might expect over the years to reduce demand for Azerbaijan and other countries' hydrocarbon exports, thus generating potential instability in its institutions. At the same time, I think we need to understand that in Azerbaijan, the question of what happens after the oil boom isn't a new one. It's something that Azerbaijan has been thinking about for quite a while, given that its hydrocarbon resources are a huge part of its economy, but are relatively smaller than many of its neighbors. So Azerbaijan's oil production has been in decline since the early 2010s. Different projections project different things, but it's not infinite, and they've known that for a while. Into this conversation, or in order to address those issues, the country has, or the government has developed significant economic diversification plans that have been ongoing to develop new sectors, to invest in agriculture to some extent, but also building Baku up as a transit point, both for energy resources as well as a cargo hub. Tourism has been a significant area of development here, and hosting international events like the COP as generating not just increased attention for Azerbaijan, but also visitors and revenue in that way. They've also invested in green energy. So as part of the stated plan of Azerbaijan's government, there's a discussion about shifting from producing hydrocarbon exports to investments in solar energy, wind energy, so that it will continue to be an energy exporter, but just of a different sort. So far, of course, all of these are early days. There are some projects that have gotten off the ground, but they've been relatively early at this moment. And so the question becomes, to what extent does economic diversification, does the green energy transition in Azerbaijan undermine or reinforce its political and economic institutions? So we can talk more about that.
Great, thanks so much, Jody. So Laurence, please, over to you.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Tina and Jody, for these very interesting papers. In my comments, I want to talk about three core dynamics, which I think are useful in helping us to navigate the new geoeconomic reality in the South Caucasus. The first of these is the decline in projects in block-based regionalism. So I think those of us who've been watching the region for a long time are used to thinking about it in terms of competing blocks and different geopolitical choices. Georgia's European choice, Armenia's Eurasian choice, and non-alignment in Azerbaijan's case. But we see that Georgian and Armenian commitments to their respective European and Eurasian memberships are increasingly in doubt. And so we're seeing a situation where calculations based or analysis based on zero-sum competition in a bipolar system are obsolete. Rather than divergence into different blocks, we're actually seeing a new kind of convergence, not around geopolitical poles of attraction, but instead on the rejection of clear alignments and on the value of multivectoralism or multi-alignment. And for the European Union, this is at least in part due to the fact that its economic offer is seemingly not as attractive as was once believed, as Tina's paper shows for Georgia, and it is tied to normative commitments that other markets don't insist on. The second dynamic that I think is crucial is new forms of strategic interaction amongst the regional powers, and in particular the solidification of interactions across the Russian, Iranian, and Turkish triangle. So the war in Ukraine has shaped incentives for Russia and Iran in particular to cooperate in building a post-sanctions economic order that is independent of the West and independent of the dollar. And in the South Caucasus, the two states have a key opportunity in this direction with the International North-South Transport Corridor project. The two states have a history of working in a triadic framework with Turkey to keep Euro-Atlantic and multilateral actors at bay, for example, in Syria. And this framework is tentatively spreading to the South Caucasus in the form of the so-called 3+3 format. Now, this is still a very contradictory, very fluid process with no common end goal or long-term vision for the South Caucasus. But it's making a different kind of offer to the states of the region. And that is of becoming a nexus of multipolarity through which trade and transit can pass outside of the sanctioned mainstream. And there are clear economic benefits for the South Caucasus states in playing this role, as we see in the surges in GDP. And so this points to how we see two different geoeconomic modus operandi have solidified in the region since 2022. Economic integration into a common economic space in the form of customs unions and blocs, and economic mediation as nodes that are mediating economic flows between different blocs. Now, the third dynamic is the opening for regional states to exercise perhaps more agency than at any time since their independence. And I see a lot of parallels between the South Caucasus today and Central Asia after 9/11. The South Caucasus has become a concentrated focus of new geopolitical interest from Moscow, Brussels, Washington, Ankara, Tehran, and to a lesser extent, Beijing. And this is interest that the regional states can control and mediate. And Tina and Jody's papers, I think, in different ways, highlight new patterns of agency. On the one hand, we are seeing more strategic ambiguity with regard, as I've discussed, to bloc membership, to accession processes. This is what we see in Georgia vis-à-vis the European Union, and we see it in Armenia vis-à-vis the Eurasian Union, and in particular in the domain of security towards the Collective Security Treaty Organization. There is more room for hedging, for wiggle room, and for a whole host of extended intermediate positionings that are based on the premise of not making a choice between blocs. And on the other hand, we see in domestic politics the tightening of personal or factional control over politics and institutions. And Jody's paper provides ample evidence of this in Azerbaijan, where personal control has been hugely boosted, of course, by military victory in 2020. But beyond that, we are seeing a rent-seeking regime that is showing how to outlive its original and primary sources of rents. So overall, the three states in the region are converging on what amounts to a kind of locational rent-seeking by converting their interstitial positioning in Eurasia's fractured geopolitics into not only monetary rents, but normative derogations crucial to sustaining political incumbency. So I have two questions that I'd like to put to Tina and Jody. So Tina, your paper highlights that despite coming into force a decade ago, Georgia's free trade agreement with the EU has not resulted perhaps in the expected growth, and that from the perspective of 2023, the EU shares in Georgia's imports and exports have actually declined. And this is significant given that access to the EU's market has been seen as the principal carrot offered by the association agreements in the framework of the Eastern Partnership. So how do we assess this outcome? Are we overestimating the carrots of association? And do we see a reevaluation in Georgia of the purely economic benefits of association when these are divorced from a pro-European normative orientation? And to follow on from that, what is the lesson for Armenia in its current situation? And Jody, a question to you. Your paper highlights how local elites in Azerbaijan are effectively adapting to geoeconomic change in ways that reinforce their hold on power. What leverage or influence, if any, do we in Europe have to moderate that? In a multipolar world, is there any room left for conditionality? Or to put that in a more banal way, do we still have sticks in our toolkit? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, please.
Thank you so much, Laurence. This was very comprehensive. I think perhaps even more comprehensive than our own introductions, and very, very good questions. Start with some of the things you mentioned. Economic offer of the EU maybe is not as attractive as you mentioned. I mean, here we are talking still about the country that is an enlargement basket of the European Union. And just to highlight that this enlargement, unlike to the past enlargement, which was the big bang enlargement back in 2004, is really motivated by security concerns. And this is not just economic offer, and this is why we see what we see in the results, right? Because we are talking about the countries that border or are hardly influenced by Russia. And the next enlargement wave, or the gradual integration, as the EU is now talking more about, is simply not going to happen if security concerns are not addressed. Because what we also see in the paper is that everything can and is weaponized. And that's where the security comes into the play, right? Now, what happened to the DCFTA? DCFTA is indeed very deep and comprehensive, and we should not forget that EU single market is a very, very economically very attractive offer, because this is a very, very large market of the 27 EU member states. However, this comes with the thousands of regulations and the directives, so-called EU acquis, and if you do not come in compliance with it, and if you do not implement it, even if you remove the tariff barriers, you do not access or you do not benefit with the full access to the single market. And that's what we are facing and what we're seeing in Georgia. Georgia has implemented a lot of EU acquis, approximative legislation implemented, but implementation still has some hurdles. And these are the non-tariff barriers that stand in the way. For instance, for agricultural products, sanitary, phytosanitary measures that simply are not in compliance because there is no laboratory in the country, for instance, that would fully meet the EU standards, right? So this is a big non-tariff barrier. TBT, technical barriers to trade for industrial goods, for instance. The other one, the underdeveloped trade corridors, because, for instance, Georgia doesn't have the land border with the EU, which in a way is a trade barrier. Underdeveloped potential of the Black Sea, and above all, the lack of proper domestic economic policies that would be focused to take and reap the full benefits of the DCFTA, because there is no trade agreement that can play as a magic pill. In the end, the implementation of the agreement and the benefiting from it always lies in the hands of the domestic policies. And here, I mean, this is really in the hands of Georgia. And Georgia's economic policy simply was not that focused on that if we see what is happening in the country. And then what is the lesson learned for Armenia? And this is a very, very good question, because over the past year, we've been hearing, I mean, Yerevan was very vocal on several occasions that Armenia is now, or could be now, considering European perspective. After ditching the association agreement a decade ago. So the lesson learned for Armenia is very, very comparable economy to Georgia. It's a small open economy, really dependent on trade. The lesson learned is that even if Armenia and the EU would remove tariff barriers, it would take Armenia a lot of time, effort, and the financial resources to come in compliance with the EU acquis to actually really access the EU single market. Number one. And number two, and more important than a number one for Armenia, is that we talked a lot about Armenia's political and security ties with the Eurasian Economic Union and Russia and the membership into CSTO, but economic dependence is absolutely massive with Russia. And so decoupling from the dependencies on Russia will be extremely painful. We're talking about the country which imports most of its energy, above 70% from Russia. Most of its wheat, more than 90% from Russia. Russia sources 1/3 of Armenia's trade and around 60% of FDIs and remittances. This is massive. And so, decoupling will be very, very painful for the society. So this is the lesson learned. So first, it has to decouple, and second, it has to couple with the EU single market, which will take time simply. And so, with this in mind, then we question really how credible it is for Armenia to now reconsider, take the U-turn, and really, go back to the DCFTA if the DCFTA was back on the table. I think I will stop here to be brief.
Yes, I would further echo some thought-provoking comments. And I think, Laurence, what you pointed out was that some of our longstanding assumptions about alliances across the region and geopolitical leanings are being questioned. They're essentially no longer valid. So we see a real reordering in the South Caucasus vis-a-vis the geopolitics. And I was really interested in what you mentioned about the dynamics have created an opening for these states to themselves assert some agency in foreign politics. And I think it's worth pointing out that that raises a question of exactly who in those states are the ones, let's say, driving that agency and whose interests are being served. Because it can be frustrating to deal with a multipolar situation, or it makes life more difficult sometimes. But at the same time, it's not in and of itself a bad thing for any three of these states to be able to have more agency. But it does mean, I think, that we have to think harder about opening that black box of whose interests within the state are being pursued internationally. In response to your question, yes, as you noted in my article, I try to consider the ways that Azerbaijan's elites are adapting to this new economic situation, and in particular, the extent to which these global shifts, mean perhaps an end to the rentier state that has been so stable for a while. But what I try to raise is the possibility that rentierism can continue in other ways, that essentially rent-seeking elites may find other sources of rents or try to create them to substitute for the easy money that was coming from the hydrocarbon industry. And it's worth noting, of course, that Azerbaijan is not just an exporter of oil, but also of gas. So it's not, despite the declining oil exports, gas is really ramping up. So that's just one example of ways that they're adapting without necessarily wanting or trying to reform their entire model that served them so well. In terms of what leverage Europe has and what sticks may be available, I think we also can think about, there's sticks, but there's also carrots. The removal of carrots is also a stick in and of itself. And there's a few ideas that I try to end the article with. One is this issue of gas. So Azerbaijan and the EU have agreed to double gas exports to European markets to substitute for Russian supplies since 2022. Of course, with that comes the need for infrastructure investment and building the capacity to do that. So that, I think, is an opportunity for partnership and cooperation between the two parties, but also is an area in which Europe may be able to offer some carrots with some conditions there. It's certainly not as easy as it sounds, but I think Azerbaijan is looking for, I assume, partnerships there and some technical capacity as well. And the other area is in Azerbaijan, the development of Azerbaijan's green energy sector. That's a highly technical sector. It's capital intensive, much like the fossil fuel industry itself. So that's not something that Azerbaijan is going to be able to do alone. They've partnered with, other foreign partners already, public and private, but it's worth Europe thinking about what Europe has to offer to help develop that sector, but also what conditions might be attached to that.
Great, thank you so much. I mean, I'll make these observations, but you don't answer them yet. But I think very interesting in your paper, Jody, talking about this green transition in Azerbaijan, and also the fact that there is a project, a cable. It's an Azerbaijan, Georgia, Black Sea, Romania, Hungary submarine electricity cable project, and surely that also gives some potential leverage in how the tendering for which companies are involved in Azerbaijan to try and have a more open governance model in those tenders. Also, Tina, I mean, this is maybe to pick up later, but it's interesting in your paper, both that the kind of contradiction that both the trade relationship with Georgia has actually got a bit weaker recently, and yet the EU remains the biggest provider of FDI to Georgia. And I suppose the question is that FDI being spent in the right way by the EU in Georgia? But hold those two thoughts, because I want to go to the room first, collect some questions, and then if people want to ask questions online, how should they do that? In the chat? Oh, you've already got them. Okay, but first of all, we'll go to the room, collect 2 or 3 questions. 1 question each, please. Not we haven't a bit pressed for time, so no more than 1 question each, please. This gentleman here, please introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm Edward Grigorian. I'm studying at the College of Europe in the faculty IRD. So my question, actually I had many questions, but I will choose one. So about the COP29, Jody talked about the importance of COP29 for Azerbaijan. And do you think that it would be possible to somehow try to regulate it and make the 2 parts sign the agreement before COP29? Because we are searching for the ways to sign the peace agreement, which would allow Armenia also to decouple from Russia's influence, economic and military one. So do you think COP29 could be used in a more smart way and impose 2 sides to take initiative to sign the agreement? And also related to that, the energy. So much energy from Azerbaijan is coming to Europe. Can we use it in a smart way also to impose some carrots, give them the initiative to sign the agreement and take the way to democracy? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Who else in the room has a question? Don't be shy. I'm sure you have lots of thoughts. Please, yeah.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Ivan. I'm from the Bulgarian permanent representation to the EU. I spent much of my professional time in the region. It was years ago, in Georgia especially. So the region is very close to my heart. But my question is the following. Do you see any mistakes, any wrongdoings, any guilt from the side of the European Union for the situation as it is now in the South Caucasus, both in terms of economic development and in terms of security? Because we are quite often criticized by Azerbaijan of adopting double standards. Sometimes we are criticized by our Georgian friends, and happily enough, now we have very good prospects in the relations with Armenia. This is my question. Thank you.
Thank you. So why don't you take these? And also maybe if you want to pick up on my question as well.
Sure, Tom. Sorry, that was to me, right?
Yeah.
So starting with your question, which is very, very interesting, just to explain it for the audience as well, not only in FDIs, but also in trade, EU is the largest trade partner for the EU. But the disappointment comes that the EU's share into Georgia's trade has not been picking up, has not been growing since signing of the DCFTA. And just to add, the trade relations is pretty asymmetric because Georgia runs large trade deficit with the EU, right? So exports have not been growing. And here comes a little bit of disappointment. Now, this is also very similar how EU engages with the other candidate countries, and I have in mind also some of the Western Balkan countries. And we see the dynamics clearly that EU is ready to actually invest in those regions economically. However, the candidate countries, including Georgia, are not necessarily ready to reap the full benefits of what the EU offers. And that's what we actually see then into the numbers. So the question is how EU should support those countries to reap the full benefits of the agreements. And I will link this to this question from you about what were the mistakes from the EU, right? First of all, there is a need for more capacity building and more support from the EU to come in compliance with the EU acquis, and I talked about it, non-tariff barriers to trade, more support for the compliance with SPS and DBT measures. This requires a lot of funding, and EU is aware of that, to give a new momentum for the trade to pick up. And another thing is using conditionality properly. And Georgia is a very, very good example for that, because country has been a front runner in the Eastern Partnership format. This was before Georgia would become a candidate country. And if the EU has really applied the merit-based approach, Georgia should have offered more opportunities and more access to the single market, more integration, well before country would be backsliding on democracy, right? So now country has got candidate status now because of the changed geopolitical circumstances, but the country has been declining, right? I mean, the democratic backsliding cannot be more obvious than it is right now. And again, where is the conditionality? What does the EU do, right? This is complete mix in the merit-based approach that EU preaches to follow, but it has never really been fully applied in practice, and we see the basically outcomes of it. And just to draw the parallels to the latest developments, this is now the candidate country, right? Where are the stakes when there is such a democratic backsliding in the country? Where are, for instance, sanctions? Where are the other measures EU could put forward, right? So we're seeing this again and again. So I'll stop here.
Right, thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think in terms of the possibility of this developing or manifesting the green, sorry, not the green COP, the peace COP agreement, I'm going to leave to Laurence, who's a specialist in that. But more generally, I think that the COP, especially after yesterday's US election results, it's even less clear exactly what we should expect to unfold over the next couple of weeks. But it does give an opportunity for Azerbaijan to show some leadership on this in this front in terms of climate agreements, progress and mitigation. At the same time, I think they will need to be met with genuine reforms in order to for that to be a true success story. So I think that, Tom, your point about the cable, the submarine electric cable, is a good one. That's just one example of the opportunities for collaboration that also can come with little nudges and conditionality between Azerbaijan and Europe. So you mentioned the need for clean and transparent tendering for those infrastructure projects. We also can think about some of the financing models that could be involved in that construction, as well as more generally, I think, pushing for increased transparency, not just in awarding the contracts and in the tendering process, but in the ownership of the firms that are, of the beneficial ownerships of the firms that are competing for it. Since that often is quite obscured, which has all of the downstream effects of obscuring who's involved in the tendering, and after all.
Thanks. Laurence, do you want to pick up the
question on the likelihood of an agreement being signed? Yeah, we've heard about the Peace COP idea, and we've heard a lot of statements around the fact that there are 17 or 16 articles out of 19 that have been agreed, and it's just, those last two that are eluding the negotiators. But I think there's a real risk here of just getting lost in the optics of peace. We have the COP29 event happening next week, but the Armenian-Azerbaijani peace process has its own rhythm, which is much more long-term. And I think we should also be, not too fixated on signatures on a document. We have to be much more attentive to the wider environment. And I want to mention that, we have people who've been arrested and charged on the basis of their contacts with Armenians, the case of Bahruz Samedov in particular. So, without that wider environment being in place, I think we should be cautious about what an agreement could deliver. What could be, I think, optimal for next week would be agreement on a new package of confidence-building measures, joint action on the many environmental issues that Armenia and Azerbaijan can't solve on their own, from pollution, water resource management is a particular issue for both countries. And I think that would be I think, a progressive step embedding a cycle of confidence building measures. And given that the COP17 on biodiversity has been allocated to Armenia, I think that offers another kind of time, another horizon for a cyclical process of these confidence building measures.
Great. Thanks so much, Laurence. Now I've got 3 questions online. I'm going to try and broaden them a little. One is about Viktor Orban and Georgian Dream. I don't know if, but why did we possibly, in the light of the US election, the fact that I think those of us who watched the US presidential debate, it was quite striking that the one foreign leader that Donald Trump mentioned by name happened to be the European leader of a country of 10 million people, which is Viktor Orban, which is the success of that sort of alternative, as he describes it, a liberal, civilizational European model. And of course, he's actually quite active in the South Caucasus. He flew to Georgia immediately after the election. He congratulated Georgian Dream, in fact, even before the results were fully announced. So he's also got quite a friendly relationship with Azerbaijan. So a question there, which would be, to what extent is the South Caucasus looking to, not to Brussels, but to Budapest as its European model? There's a question here about, which set from online. I don't have the names, so excuse me if I'm not naming you. The EU should be more engaged in promoting regional cooperation between the 3 countries and using carrots, not sticks. What is stopping the EU? And then a question also about Turkey's foreign policy in the region. To what extent any comments about Turkey's strategy, ambitions in the region? Don't feel free to pick any of those questions, not necessarily all 3 of them. Who wants to?
Shall I go ahead?
Sure.
Sure. So starting with the Viktor Orban's engagement, very well described by Tom. I mean, Viktor Orban's position definitely weakens the position of the European Union, right? It definitely sticks out. And it happens to coincide with certain governments of the certain countries into the EU's neighborhood and enlargement countries, which is in this case Georgia, which is Azerbaijan, which are certain also Western Balkan countries, just drawing the parallels. And this is not a coincidence, right? The governments that show democratic backsliding tend to team up with Viktor Orban for obvious reasons. And this can, of course, and is dangerous, right? We see that Orban's veto still has a lot of power. In critical moments, EU keeps finding the common voice, but it becomes more and more problematic. And what it really highlights is to what extent EU is equipped well with the conditionality mechanisms to actually handle the current member states or the new member states that are standing in a line to cope with this, disagreement, and when they really stick out. So I don't know, let's see what can happen bilaterally. I don't see that much right now, but it's very, very interesting to see what will happen. Right now, this is just very dangerous play. About supporting regional cooperation, and this question has been there, especially when we talk about economic regional cooperation, because these are similar economies. But as I said, when 3 countries choose very, very different foreign policy stances, when they follow different legislation or standards, use legislation completely differs from the post-Soviet, the heritage that Soviet Union countries had as the standards, it of course then causes divergence. I think regional cooperation would have been much more successful if these 3 countries have been very much aligned with their foreign policies. Trade is just part of the foreign policy. And when there is so much divergence, I think that's what we see. The rest, what is there without anybody's engagement, this is transit, because they border still each other. And this is some ad hoc trade, used cars move quite a lot. Whatever is demanded then on the other side, which is usually Russia or the Eurasian Economic Union. So these are the 2 ways of the market, right? And sometimes market finds the way through the transit and some ad hoc trade. And then the other one, the Turkey strategy, again, I'm just only picking up the economic side of it, and Jody and others will maybe add more. Turkey has a very clear strategy how it engages with the neighbors and with the region, and very much is focused in investing in critical infrastructure, such as ports, airports, and we see more and more Turkey, and also Turkey is very much present when it comes to the transit and logistics sectors, right? These are of critical importance, and they can also be weaponized. And this is something to really remain cautious about. I mean, to compare it, for instance, with the investments that come from the EU. EU investments, mostly greenfield, they come into the sectors that are very important for those countries. Energy, for instance, in Georgia, financial services, other services, but these critical infrastructure are still in the hands of Turkey and China. And that is something that, not to forget about.
Yeah, I think picking up on what Tina said, so when we think about the extent to which the Viktor Orban model is a model for the region, I was struck by what you just said about he's seen as kind of being aligned with democratic states that are democratic backsliding or have that. And I think that helps me to understand or conditions what I want to say, which is that Azerbaijan is not in the same position that Georgia was in, right? So, I mean, although I think, Azerbaijan and Hungary have friendly relations and increasing ties with some of these transit plans. I don't know how much Orban's model of liberalism is actually an orientation for Azerbaijan, given that they're just not in the same place. They're not in a situation of democratic backsliding to a liberalism. It's more an older model of rentier political economy. On regional cooperation, actually, I think that was another thing that struck me about your original comments, Laurence, which is, I think we're also seeing potentially some evidence of increased regional cooperation rather than sort of three independent states. So something that Laurence had mentioned in our organization for this meeting was thinking about the extent to which the region is coming together or not. And obviously, Azerbaijan and Armenia condition some of our views on this, but at the same time, if we think about just the relations between Azerbaijan and Georgia, just in sheer terms of the economy, they're increasingly integrated. SOCAR is one of the highest taxpayers in Georgia. The pipelines obviously link them together. So I don't know what the future of that will hold, but at the same time, this region, I think, is their cooperation and their integration is part and parcel of their increased agency, even as the three states are pursuing their own policies. There's still, I think, an alignment on that side.
You want to say, Laurence?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, it seems to me that regional cooperation of the South Caucasus is this kind of holy grail that we've all been sort of advocating for and has never managed to displace special relationships with key geopolitical patrons outside of the region. But I wonder if, as a result of this reevaluation that we've been talking about, of bloc memberships and movement towards a kind of consensus on the value of multivectoralism, that does actually create more scope for a bottom-up region building process. But that does take elites in the region out of a comfort zone. I think elites in the region have been very comfortable with this pattern of what you might call a geopolitical patron clientism. And to build a region from the bottom up implies that you're going to need regional governance. It means norms. It means agreements. And I'm not sure that the elites that we see today in the region are ready for that. So I think the jury's still out on whether we're going to see real region building.
I mean, yeah, sure. Go.
Cooperation is maybe a strong word in this context, but the bottom up is more of a alignment or mutual interests rather than any ideological process or commitments or necessarily cooperation in the sort of institutional sense.
I very much agree with Jody, because indeed what we see, for instance, between Georgia and Azerbaijan, this is mutually beneficial, right? But it's one particular sector. But the others are like digital. There are so many sectors when it comes, and they're not picking up. There is not enough motivation at certain states. That was my point. I very much agree with you both.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that, I mean, something I've also written about and tried to promote over the years, but it's so difficult. I mean, so many closed borders. I mean, Armenia, Turkey we've got so used to that the fact that border has been closed since since 1993. And really, there should be, nothing stopping that border being open, and that would really transform the region. But obviously, Armenia-Azerbaijan border is also closed and dependent on the peace agreement. But even Azerbaijan's, because of COVID, bizarrely still as used as Azerbaijan's land borders with Georgia are still closed as well. So the business cooperation currently is only at a very, very elite level or underground via pipeline. So get the borders open, get the railways working, and then maybe this is what the EU should be doing. Scoping out with some international development banks, getting those railways working. The Armenia-Georgia border, now you can actually cross without a foreign passport. That's positive. That's a positive development. But yet the infrastructure across that border is still pretty bad. It still takes something like how many hours? 8 hours or something on the train to get from to Yerevan to Tbilisi, which is probably half the distance from I traveled today on the Eurostar from London. So some pretty elementary things are still not happening there. Can I just also mention on the liberalism and Hungary point, and Natalie Sabanadze, many of you know, former Georgian ambassador here now with us in London, actually a colleague of Laurence's is at Chatham House, wrote a great paper for us last year about Georgia and Europe, and also already flagging this issue about this kind of Orban model in which encouraging candidate states to kind of to regard have a kind of haggling with the EU, cherry picking, saying we want this from you and you want that. The power relationship she sets out in that paper is very different from what it was, unfortunately, 20 years ago. It's strengthened the power of those who are engaged in democratic backsliding, but still, nominally EU candidate members. So we've got a few minutes. Anyone in the room, please? Yes, we'll prioritize you in the room. Please give us your name and give us your question.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for your remarks. I'm Alexandra. I work at Rasmussen Global. We actually work together with you, Tina, on Armenia. And one of my questions does deal with Armenia, because the picture you painted was quite bleak in the sense that there's just so many regulations that Armenia would have to agree to in order to increase trade between Armenia and the EU. Do you have any other ways there could be, an increase in trade which would not include a hypothetical DCFTA? And the other question concerns the Crossroads of Peace initiative. I mean, we already kind of touched upon on that, but how do you see the success of that without a possible peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan, seeing that is kind of necessary for this initiative to work? And is there a way the EU can actually help in bringing forward this initiative? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, over there, probably one more question from the room. No, wait for the microphone, please. Otherwise, we won't be able to hear you.
Good evening. I'm Irina Safarian. I'm here by my own capacity. So it's not a question, it's just a small comment to the statement by you, Mr. de Waal, about the fact that there is nothing basically, how to say, stands in between Armenia and Azerbaijan or Turkey to open the border. Well, you said that basically there is no...
Talking about Turkey is that the conditions really have been met for the opening of the border.
But I don't know how well the public is here informed, but just a year ago there was an ethnic cleansing of ethnic Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh, from Artsakh. And to say that there is no problem between two nations to open the border, while Turkey was the biggest supporter to commit this crime and to make this ethnic cleansing. So sorry, but I can't just stand in here and sit in here and just listen that there is no problem in between Armenia, Azerbaijan, or Turkey, because we should raise the issue of 160,000 Armenians ethnically cleansed from Nagorno-Karabakh, which is basically, it's not touched in here, and nobody says that they have the right to return. Oh, thank you.
Thank you for the comment. But I mean, I would mention that the Armenian government has set no preconditions for the opening of the border and the normalization of relations with Turkey. So that is the position of the Armenian government. Okay,
Thank you. My name is Katie Chumbadze. I'm Deputy Head of Mission of Georgia to the European Union.
Yeah, good to see you, yes.
First, thank you for organizing this event and for the topic, because I'm always very glad to see that the region is in mind of think tanks, opinion makers, and officials in the EU services all the time, and it is largely discussed from political or from the economic angle. And I must say that the economic angle is not always the case, and I think that it was important to discuss and touch upon this topic. I didn't have the question. Probably I would make a comment, provide my thoughts on two topics. One on
briefly, if you can, Katie, because
yes,
we're running out of time.
Yeah. So one regarding the Georgia's EU accession path and the EU integration. I think that the association agreement and DCFTA has played a crucial role in terms of Georgia's rapprochement to the European Union, and the point that more than 65% of DCFTA and more than 60% of association agreement are implemented, that actually cover large part of EU acquis, was very important part and the background and fundament why Georgia actually has demonstrated very good performance in terms of meeting EU acquis chapter by chapter, cluster by cluster, and still even in the current enlargement package, Georgia has demonstrated quite good level of preparation despite the challenges that country faced throughout this year. I think if we make comparative analysis that shows a very good level of preparation of the country. And of course, despite those challenges, Georgia will continue those aspirations and very strong and irreversible path towards the European Union, because Georgia doesn't have any alternative rather than the EU accession. Very quickly about the regional policy in the region. Probably Georgia is one of rare exceptions throughout the region that enjoys very good cooperation with everybody, be it in the Eastern Partnership or to zoom in the South Caucasus region. And I think that that is very important also to capitalize on that. And Georgia has many times showed the readiness to play a role of moderator or facilitator of the links between the regional countries, and it has delivered in that case also when it was a very important exchange of the mining maps and also the war prisoners years ago. And I think that the offer Georgia is always highlighting somehow to develop the economic cooperation and to develop ties in different fields and sectors, be it trade, be it different, green energy or different type of corporations, are having a very good ground in terms of benefiting from the economic cooperation in political terms when we talk about peace and stability throughout the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're more or less out of time, but so any concluding comments, responses? We also have a question. Maybe Laurence, any?
Well, just very briefly on the crossroads of peace. I mean, it's not just contingent on a peace agreement. It's contingent on working out the transit modalities across southern Armenia, where there are very different conceptions. And the great unknown there is Russia's ongoing role. As you know, Article 9 of the ceasefire agreement stipulates Russian presence. I think in the long term, neither Armenia nor Azerbaijan want that. So how can they get there to avoid it is still unclear. They've taken out the transit question from the agreement that's currently being negotiated. So I get the sense that this problem has simply been postponed. So I think crossroads of peace is still very much up in the air.
I don't think actually I have anything to add.
Sure,
Last word
Tom.
goes to you.
Sure, thank you so much. So starting with Armenia questions, it's a very good question because Armenia is currently under a Eurasian Economic Union, and so whatever can be alternative to the DCFTA have to be in compliance with Armenia's commitment into the Eurasian Economic Union. This, however, cannot concern further liberalization trade in goods because that is a contradiction. What is alternative is the services, right? So on the services that can be more liberalization, and particularly because Armenia has comparative advantage in computer digital services, that offers some untapped potential, if you ask me. And I'm speaking again from Georgia's experiences. DCFTA has not liberalized as much trade in services and neither that much digital trade, but Georgia's services trade in the digital sector has 9-fold increase over the past decade. So there is their potential because these are economies which are services based. Around 40% of those economies are services based. That offers potential. And coming back to the comments on Georgia, and I'll be very brief. Thank you so much, Katie, for the questions. I very much agree with you on the implementation of the association agreements, and the DCFTA's country has performed really well, and that's what I said, that it was really best performer in the Eastern Partnership countries. But when we read the enlargement reports, it's around 100 pages long report that I read carefully last week. Preparedness is there, but the way we should read these reports is the direction of progress. The report in most of the areas says limited progress or backsliding, limited progress, backsliding. And that very much shows how much potential country has, how much it can build on its institutional capacity and implement the EU acquis, and how much democratic backsliding and all the backsliding on the reform stand in the way. And I very much agree, as being a Georgian myself, that Georgia really does not have alternative to remain free, independent state because of all the vulnerabilities and security threats from Russia. And this is why the democratic reforms and coming back on the European integration path, which is now frozen, is extremely important.
Great, thank you for that. Ending with an affirmation of importance of Georgia's European trajectory, despite all the competing geopolitical challenges that we've been talking about. My apologies to those of you online who asked questions that we didn't have time for. One about positive stories, one about saying fully regarding transparency in tendering Azerbaijan, but can we do that in the US as well? That's a good question, but one we probably don't have time for. Big thanks to all of you for coming. Big thanks to those who are online. My thanks to Laurence, Jody, and Tina. If you're here in the room, please do join us for a drink afterwards. Please also do read the publications, particularly many publications, but particularly the recent papers by Jody and by Tina. Thank you.